We want to transform the American healthcare system. We believe it's underperforming. We believe that it's not providing the care that the American people pay for it. And I got to give you a couple of numbers so you think about as you go about your work. So every year, we spend $4.5 trillion on healthcare. The GDP of France is 3.2 million. So all of the French people working every day, 365 days a year, do not equal the size of what we spend on healthcare. That's number one. Number two, that $4.5 trillion comes out of every American household. Everybody likes to pretend like it ain't your money, but it's in fact your money. $4.5 trillion collected out of every American household every year, and by 2030 projected to be $6 trillion, which means that it's going to be almost double the GDP of France. And they say to us, we don't have enough money to provide you health care. I say we need an audit. We got to get ourselves an audit, right? Because $4.5 trillion is a lot of money. It's a ton of money. And we have the capacity to address rare diseases, to make sure that people who are suffering rare disease in urban centers and in rural centers get access to the care that we are obligated to provide them as part of our civil society. So as you go about your work today, know that NMQF is here to partner with you in any way that you'd ask us and allow us to participate. So I want to thank you for having your meeting today here with us and look forward to future conversations. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Gary. It's such an honor to be on the same platform as Gary. They've been doing this work for so long. So just by show of hands, how many people this is the first time attending an NMQF Leadership Summit? I love that. Gary, look around. These are all your first timers. So RDDC knows how to bring it and to help NMQF stay on the map. And as Gary and I were talking yesterday, they haven't kicked us out of the zip code yet. So we continue to talk about this really important information. And I'm so glad that you all have choices, that you could be here today, and you all have made that choice to be with us. So good morning, everyone. I'm a little bit more formal than Gary, so I want to make sure I hit these right points. Thanks to Taylor for helping me with this. I'm Jenifer Waldrop. If you don't know me, on behalf of the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition, I wanted to thank Gary and the rest of the NMQF team for having us here today. They have this unwavering, as you heard, leadership and health equity. They've been doing the specific leadership summit for over 20 years. And so it really is an honor for us to be here because they are highly committed to being a champion of change. As the executive director, I'm at 2.5 months, actually, or two and a half years. It's actually, yeah. So actually, the half-year mark was last week. So it's an April half-year mark. So it's been 2.5 years. Thank you, everybody. So those that know. And I hope you know that we've been really committed to this work. And despite what's going on in this area, we are really connected in building up these relationships. And the coalition, as Gary mentioned, is really important because many of you have been doing this work much longer than I have, for example, but we've been trying to do it in a different way. And so if we can do it together, then that will help make us stronger. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the people and the organization who made today really possible. A huge thanks to the Black Women's Health Imperative, my employer, for being behind the scenes support and for their preparation. And all the vendors, as you can see in the room, are helping us out make this a great reality that we're going to hold on to. I want to thank our Links to Equity Partnership and our Bold Vision. Later today, you'll hear from their founder, Deanna Darlington, and Gary also recognized her earlier today. And thanks to our generous sponsors, and many of who are in the room today, Johnson & Johnson, Novartis, UCB, Sobi, and Holland & Knight. So your belief in this mission to bring our work to life is really, I'm really appreciative of it all. NMQF's commitment to building a more just and inclusive healthcare system really resonates with RDDC's mission to eliminate disparities across the rare disease continuum. It's especially meaningful to join you this year as we focus on evidence-informed solutions for medically underserved communities, a mission that is at the very core for what RDDC stands for. Today is a call to bold, coordinated action. We'll explore the urgent need to reshape the clinical research ecosystem so it truly serves all communities and no one is left behind. We'll hear from advocates, researchers, policymakers, and trusted community voices who are leading the way every day to close persistent gaps in access, trust, and representation in rare disease care. From reimagining clinical trials to empowering advocacy groups to shaping inclusive policies, today is about solutions, collaboration, and momentum. Thank you again for standing with us. We're so excited to take this journey with you forward today. Now, without further ado, we can get started with our first session. Our first topic, of course, is in diversity and rare diseases and clinical trials. So the question is, and the statement is, we know that diversity in clinical trial populations is essential to ensure that treatments are effective for all. How can we ensure that the medically underrepresented populations in these groups, including racial minorities, people with disabilities, and as Gary mentioned, from those that living from the geography perspective, rural, urban, etc., how can these folks actively be recruited and included in rare disease clinical trials? So we're going to start with Dr. Jamie. So introduce yourself and how can
That's putting me on the spot.
Well, everyone's going to answer that question.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with this group of panelists, and thank you for inviting me here. I'm Jamie Freedman. I'm a hematologist oncologist by training. I'm currently the chief medical officer at Sobi, which is a rare disease company that helps support this event. And I spent my entire career in industry. So prior to this, I was at Genentech Roche. And the reason I raised that is because I got very involved in health equity related research during the pandemic, which sort of was the silver lining, I think, of the pandemic, is to be able to include more patient populations. I continue to see patients even today at the UCSF Veteran Affairs Medical Center, which in itself is an opportunity to reach underrepresented, underserved patient populations. So to answer your first question, I think probably there's many different ways to try to recruit patients that are underrepresented onto clinical trials. But if I had to pick one most critical way of doing that, it's to reach out to community-based hospitals to be able to find those patients. Too often, the clinical trials that are done, particularly by manufacturers, are done in the large academic medical centers, which has a very homogeneous, primarily white population. And so to be able to get a more diverse population by going to community-based centers, you actually have access to the more diverse U.S.-based population for our clinical trials.
Thank you, RDDC, Jenifer, and the NMQF team for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with such amazing panelists and all of you. Harsha Rajasimha, founder, CEO of Jeeva Clinical Trials, also a rare dad and a patient advocate. Got involved in genomics and precision medicine as a postdoctoral scientist at NIH, and then became a dad to a child with rare disease. So got me all in understanding the various perspectives with all of us come into this complex ecosystem from. So where we focus on at Jeeva Clinical Trials is primarily from a technology innovation point of view, how technology and AI can be part of this problem and which problems are ripe to address with innovation in a patient-centric way. From a recruitment and diversity point of view, my perspective has been that we are barely scratching the surface of the human population with 5-10% of the population that has been historically engaged. And we have come a long way with 1,100 approved orphan drugs, with most of the clinical trials conducted in United States, European Union. Moving forward, my perspective is we need to go global. There is a lot of work to be done right here at home to engage the rural and urban populations better in different languages and cultures and flexibilities. But I think we got to go global. That's the number one. And second is start early and start years before the clinical trial actually begins to be able to recruit the patients, say from patient registries or natural history studies that are already have a baseline.
Good morning, and thank you so much, RDDC, and all of our organizers, Deanna, for having us here today. This is a really important subject. I'm LaVarne Burton. I'm president and CEO of the American Kidney Fund. We are a patient advocacy organization with our tentacles all over the country, providing support for patients and for people who are impacted by kidney disease in everything from prevention, awareness, and education to financial assistance, to advocacy, and to really focusing on those issues that patients consider to be important. Rare diseases is one of those issues, and we have had a very high focus on that, especially over the last several years. I think that I would agree with much of what has been said about how do we really get patients engaged in clinical trials. We have to establish relations. It is such a simple word. It is not necessarily easy to do, but you start that by reaching out, and you have to establish those relationships, letting people know who you are and why you're there, and listening to them and developing and engaging them over time, not just when you're ready to do the clinical trial, but getting their input early and in an ongoing fashion. And actually, all of the things that we talk about, I use language symbolically to be culturally relevant, but it's everything about somebody else's life, about these populations that we're trying to reach, really sitting down and talking with them in so many different ways to understand where they are and what they need in order to participate in clinical trials.
Thank you. Good morning. My name's Marshall Summar. I've been in the rare disease field since about 1985, mostly as a clinician. I'm a biochemical geneticist and clinical geneticist. Spent the first bulk of my career in Vanderbilt University, and then moved and ran the genetics program at Children's National Medical Center for around 15 years. So got to work with both rural, urban populations as well. When I was asked to co-chair the research committee for the RDDC, the first question I asked was, well, let's test the hypothesis. So we think that there are disparities in participation. Are those the case? So we worked with the National Institutes of Health and their Rare Disease Clinical Research Network, which had, what did we end up testing, over 12,000 patients, I think, something like that?
And 12 different sites.
Yeah, 12 sites, 12,000 patients. And unfortunately, the hypothesis was correct. So participation, particularly in the African American community, was below 50% of what other groups were doing. After my career in academic medicine, I now run a group that does clinical trials in rare disease. And so we've done some deep dives on both failure rates and everything else. You'd be surprised to know, well, some of you will know this, 75% of rare disease clinical trials fail. Now, it's interesting. Only about 15 to 20% of that's because the science wasn't going to work. It's actually 60% of the time because of recruitment and retention. So in any rare disease clinical trial, there is a high incentive to have all possible patients participate. And then you start saying, well, what are the root causes? Why don't people participate? Some of it can be geography. Some of it can be the trial is just too complex in its design. And one of the things we have found is that, I'm from Tennessee. We have an old phrase there called never put 2 tons of fertilizer in a 1-ton truck. But when scientists design clinical trials, they tend to load them up. Gee, it'd be great if we saw that. Shouldn't we test that? It'd be really nice to know about this. And what you end up with is a clinical trial that can be so overloaded that many families just can't participate. So there are definitely issues of you've got to get in and know your community early. The other thing is you've got to have your community participate in designing the trial. If you want people to show up and participate, give them some buy-in on the design and actually what are the important outcome markers and things like that. And that's something that's not done particularly well, I would say, in these clinical trial designs. But a lot of it is incumbent on the people running those trials, sponsoring those trials, whether it's a natural history study, whether it's to test a new therapy, things like that. You really need to get into the community early. When I talk to sponsors, I say, you don't just parachute in. This isn't like Big Pharma, although Big Pharma also tries to do things better. But you can't just show up one day and say, hey, I need 1,000 patients. Since there's 100,000 of you out here, I'm certain I can get my 1,000. In rare disease, you may be struggling to get 10. And so it's not only the right thing to do, but it's the practical thing to do to heavily invest in the community, to show up early, show up often, get the input. The other thing is when you go and talk to agencies, having the patients there with you is the most powerful voice you can have. It's their story. It's not your story. And they can tell it sometimes a lot better than you can. And they can also tell you what's going to be important to them. So I would say investing in the community early, getting involvement in both design and everything else, getting trials that people can actually afford to participate in, whether it's from time, whether it's from resources, time away from work, time away from family. And then the last thing I'll say is the burden of care in rare disease is quite high. We stress families to the max with all of the things we ask them to do between therapies, medications, visits to the physician's office, whatever. I know because I'm the one that did that to a lot of them. But you have to take that into account when you're designing a clinical trial. And if you start doing those things, and I think all of the things the other panelists have suggested, then I think you will see that start to correct. But it's going to take a lot of work. Sorry for the long answer.
Thank you. Anyone want to add anything before I go to the next question?
I think he covered everything for the session.
Class dismissed. All right. So actually, Dr. Summar, that's a great segue into my next question, which is there's so much information out there. I think it is a little bit overwhelming, but there's these amazing things out there called innovation and technology and AI. So my next question, I'm going to start with you, Dr. Summar. With the advancement in AI and decentralized clinical trials modules, there is a potential for improving clinical trials and how they are conducted. How can these technologies help overcome existing barriers in rare disease research, and particularly when it comes to patient engagement and accessibility for those non-tech savvy individuals?
All right, first off, how many of you do not have one of these? It's Washington, D.C. That would be impossible. I should ask, how many do you each have? So, absolutely, we're at a point right now where we can start to do trials. In fact, we're designing some right now in the work we do where the patient never crosses the threshold of our clinic, of our facility. Now, you can ship medications to homes. You can have people visit home who can draw blood or teach administration. You can do tele. One of the things we learned during the COVID epidemic is you can run a pretty good medical practice. My group of geneticists we'd been doing it before, so we had some experience, but we were able to do 100% of our patients by remote, doing physical examination. I mean, there's some things you can't do, but you can do almost all of it by remote. So there's no reason why you can't start moving a clinical trial into we call it a decentralized model or at-home model. Take your pick on how you do that. It requires a little creativity. Everyone is concerned, will the data be as good? Yeah, the data will actually be a little bit better because you're not playing telephone. The patient didn't tell the study associate, who then told the PI, who then told the data coordinator, who then entered it in. When you can have things on a phone where the patients actually, from an app, a little bit of smart chat, can actually get that information in a very timely fashion at their own convenience. So I think it's absolutely the time to be doing these things, and I think that can contribute to participation. I'll be curious to see what my other panelists think.
Same question.
Yes, and I think you've got some great insights.
Yeah, I want to add on something. I would first of all second everything that you've said. I want to say two words: the human factor. As we develop new technologies and as we become more sensitive to the fact that we have to logistically develop clinical trials that that facilitate the way people actually live and work and interact with their families and all of that, that we cannot leave out the human factor. The first step in participating in a clinical trial really is, well, awareness is one of the first steps. And so that's what organizations such as mine spend a lot of time doing, just educating people about what is a clinical trial and what's available, and some questions that the patient should consider in whether or not they decide to participate. But then there's the decision on, do I participate? Do I recommend to my family member or friend that they participate? And that really is something that's that human factor. And a lot of whether or not you decide to participate is going to be based upon trust. And so how do you establish that trust? And how do you have to lay out clear expectations for the patient, clear expectations of what you as a clinical trial manager will do. And you have to live up to that trust, because you want people to stay in the trials, and you want them in future situations, whether it's going with you to talk to an advisory committee, or whether it's talking about a product once it's developed, whatever it is, you want the patient to continue to have that trust, and that not just willingness, but eagerness to continue to be a part of that, and to say, this is how this helped my life. And so I think that as we develop new technologies, there are still some things that we do that we pull back from the dark ages, like calling people on the phone and talking with them, not just on a computer, giving them easy access when they have questions to call you, keeping that interaction ongoing. But I would say trust is really critical in this whole relationship.
Well said there. This is a topic I have been living and breathing for the last several years. And technology is an enabler, right? A key enabler. AI can be a key enabler. In rare diseases, we start with the patient, right? Look at the patient journey. And I think in many ways, the rare disease clinical trials and the community have exemplary models that non-rare diseases can actually learn from. And this is actually happening, right, in many of these studies. But it's got to start with the protocol. If the protocol is not written in a way that can leverage the activities to be done at home with the patient burden in mind, but also the site burden in mind, so that it's a bonding between the two. Ultimately, the magic happens between the site and the patients. And so these decentralized models, AI, one can help with patient identification, which is a key problem in rare disease, is we don't know where they exist. So unless they are identified and they are in a registry or a database and they are discoverable. And two, having the protocol designed in a way that leverages the technology options, telemedicine, minimize the number of visits to the site, location of the sites, and even the number of sites. And so I think that's one key. The other part is making the technologies human-centric, patient-centric. What I mean by that, better than all in-person clinical trials, which can only address about 5% of the patient populations that are close to the metropolitan cities, large academic medical centers, versus engaging 82% of the American population that have access to steady internet. It's not 100%, but it's way better than 5% if we were to expect everyone to show up at the clinic every time. So absolutely adopting technology is a huge leap forward, rather than not doing decentralized trials. At the same time, the digital divide has to be kept in mind. And when we introduce technology, sometimes it can be a barrier. Some certain families may not be as comfortable with technology. Even to log in with a two-factor authentication can be a huge burden on some families. And so keeping those considerations in mind, there are practical ways in which human-centric technologies can be implemented effectively to maximize recruitment, retention, and the quality of data collected.
So I'm just going to add on some of the points that were already made. I mean, one of the silver linings, I think, of the pandemic was that it helped modernize how clinical trials are done. And, traditional clinical trials require that patients are frequently on the clinical site and have a high burden of procedures that are done. And that wasn't really possible with the pandemic to be able to execute on clinical trials. So we learned new ways of doing things, and one of them was, which has already been discussed, around this decentralized approach. And at one of my former companies, we did a partnership with the VA Medical Center to try to figure out how to get more rural patients onto clinical trials. And we took a completely 100% virtual approach with telehealth to interact with the investigators, digital approaches to monitor for safety findings on the patients, to do mobile nursing, to collect blood samples. And so that was a way of having, and it was a platform trial, so it wasn't actually interventional, but it was just done to show that we could actually do a trial like this and then adapt it for an interventional trial. And it was a completely successful trial. And that's really changing the way we have to do things. Now, I think post-pandemic, taking a more partial virtual approach is probably the best sort of combination of being able to still see the patients but not having the same level of burden. So that's one point. And for the rare disease population, another approach that we've taken at my current company, Sobi, to get myelofibrosis patients, which are a rare disease patient population for our drug pacritinib, is to use a trigger program. So there are very few patients who are actually seen by any one healthcare professional in the community. So if you're an HCP hematologist in the community, you may see 1 or 2 myelofibrosis patients a year. If you want them as part of clinical trials or even to get access to medicine, we've incorporated a trigger program, which is a digital approach to identify when a patient has the disease, that they are available on site, and then we can provide access of the drug or put them on a clinical trial. That trigger program has been used by other companies as well that I was at, but that's one way of getting access to rare disease patients in the population.
Thank you for that very realistic example. Appreciate it. So a few other realistic examples. Marshall had mentioned a little bit about our partnership working with him and his former group of the National Children's Hospital. I want to get the Children's National Hospital, which is here in DC. And so that paper that we've done is out in the publication area. So we're waiting for it to actually get finalized so that we can share it with everybody. So in case you were wondering where that paper is, it's with somebody trying to get it finalized, and we all know how that goes. And, for RDDC, in addition to some of that partnership, we also partnered in the PNH community, for example, and we worked with the steering committee, so doctors, patients, et cetera, and we put together information specifically on that hemoglobin blood disorder. And that one really affects more of the adult population. And so we put together a little bit of the health equity concerns from this population. We know that some of you all are partnering up, not necessarily with us, but with others. And we also know that in the children's area, so one of the reasons why actually Marshall has so much experience is because, half of the rare diseases impact children, or that's the right order. It's the order, and even more. And so there are some groups out there, like the Kidney Fund, that's doing some work with children. Could you share a little bit about that? And is that the Kidney Health for All program?
It's actually not. The Kidney Health for All program is a little bit different. We've done some really exciting work with children, but I kind of want to set up a background. When I first came to the American Kidney Fund, we used to do a calendar. We had a calendar, and we had kids from all over the country draw pictures, and we put them into a calendar. We brought them to Washington, D.C. for dinner. We now do a slightly different program. But I remember sitting one night at a table with the family, and a little girl who was about 13 talked about getting up, 3 days a week, having to get up about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and drive a very long distance to dialysis because she absolutely needed the dialysis. She was in kidney failure. She did not want to miss classes. She wanted to be like all of the other kids. And as a mother of someone who was once a teenager, I just couldn't imagine, my son, being that disciplined and doing that, or the burden really that it would have been on the family to get that child to dialysis. That's the picture of a child who's on dialysis. And if you can imagine, even babies, infants sometimes born with kidney failure may immediately need dialysis. So that's a tremendous burden on a family. often children who have rare kidney diseases don't develop as well. They don't grow, they don't develop language and motor skills sometimes, as well as other children. That affects their physical well-being, but also their psychological well-being, how they feel interacting with other children, the low self-esteem that, or even depression that they sometimes will have. And in working with kids, there are nearly 10,000 kids in this country who are in kidney failure. And the vast majority of children who have kidney disease, who are in kidney failure, it's some underlying genetic condition, very often a rare condition, and they were born with that. Observing all of those issues, we started working with children's pediatric nephrology centers. The Children's National Medical Center was one with which we have a very long history. They were involved in our original program. Around 2018 or so, we started working with the Pediatric Center at Johns Hopkins. They had a camp program for children who were in pediatric nephrology, who were on dialysis and recently had transplants. We were able to get a funder to support our activities, and we started supporting the camp. I think it was as much reinforcing and encouraging for our staff, maybe more so than the children, because our staff actually went to the camp. Then along came 2020, and the camp could not continue because of COVID. And we realized that those children were at home again without the special activity and the special connection with each other. So we started a virtual camp. And with the virtual camp, we have various activities. They're art related, they're STEM related. They're just fun activities. And they give not only the activities are a vehicle to bring the children and their families together. And when we send packages out to the children, including laptops so that they can, be on, or iPads. We send monthly kits to the children for whatever activity we're going to do that month. We send them for all the children in the family so that those children are not isolated. Their parents come on as well. And so we have expanded that from being just Johns Hopkins Pediatric Nephrology Center to, I think we're now have about 150 children from 30 states all over the country. And we do these monthly activities. We've also created a special group for children who have cystinosis, which is another rare kidney disease. And what the parents tell us, you can see the excitement in the children. And we brought some of these children in Washington to participate in various AKF activities. And what they tell us about how much this camp means to them and what the parents say about what this camp means to the children and to the families is just tremendous. It doesn't solve their medical problems, but it gives them the opportunity to meet other children who are dealing with the same issue. It gives them the opportunity to know that they're not alone. And sometimes these families can establish, relationships so that they can support each other even aside from what we're doing.
Thank you for sharing that story. And as a parent, I'm just thinking also, if you have them at camp, are the parents with them at camp, or is it the chance for the parents to also, maybe at this point, we're bringing the conversation around emotional health and mental health. It's good for the children because it gives them a little bit of that emotional piece to it because they're physically fighting all the time. And then you also have the parents that if they're not attending the camp, but they know they're at a safe place, it gives them a chance to just kind of center as well.
Yeah. Well, now we're doing the virtual camp. So the parents are actually participating with the children. And many of our staff members aside, we have staff who run this, but aside from that, many of our staff members join just because it's fun. I've done the gingerbread house session. Some of our board members join. So it gives them a chance. So the parents are included in this. The entire family is included.
Thank you. And fun, I think, is super important, isn't it? Anybody else want to add anything?
Yeah. I could not agree with you more that building community between patients is important. Rare disease can be very isolating, not only for the patient, but for the family as well. It can be isolating in the medical community because there are only a limited number of experts in the disease, which can also create trust issues as well, too. You show up in an emergency room when your child or your family member is sick, and there's no physicians ever even heard of the condition you have. So having those connections to the community, other patients, I was recently part of a trial where we brought in a number of patients with Friedreich's ataxia. They all congregated in the kitchen area of our facility, and we couldn't get them out of there for the rest of the trial. But what was neat is those families came away, and what we've been watching is they all are still talking to each other. So one thing to think about with clinical trials is not only is it a way to move the needle forward on our understanding or maybe what we can use to treat a disease, it can also be a way to build community. A lot of the patient organizations I know focus on how are we going to build treatments, things like that. But building that community, to be honest, is, I think, just as important.
I'll just quickly add that I had a younger brother who had a diabetic nephropathy, led dialysis for the last 9 months of his life at a very young age. My father had a abdominal aortic aneurysm triggered renal failure, and he was on dialysis for the last 2.5 years. And so I really appreciate what AKF is doing to make their experiences much better and less painful.
I just wanted to add, you mentioned the P&H Health Equity Initiative, and I'm familiar with that because at Sobi we have a P&H drug called pegcetacoplan that we co-commercialize with a company called Apellis. It's a rare hematological disorder, and I think the P&H Health Equity group has done a lot of great things for access to both medicine and clinical trials. One of the things that, is really important, I think, is reducing financial barriers. Whether that means providing transport for patients to be able to make it to clinical trials or just to get seen at the hospitals is really important. Sometimes providing internet access and, digital approaches to participate in some of these decentralized clinical trials, that's very important as well. So I just wanted to add that they're doing a lot of great things for access to clinical trials.
While he had these questions, these are also on my notes. My next question was going to be for you around.
May I make one addition?
Oh, sure, sure.
I did want to address our Kidney Health for All program, which is our equity program, very briefly. We started doing that a few years ago. If you're in the kidney health space, you have to be in the equity space because of the disproportionate impact of kidney disease on certain populations. But a few years ago, we decided that we really wanted to formalize that. And really increase our visibility. And so we identified 4 areas: clinical trials and greater inclusion of people of color in clinical trials, more outreach, early prevention, closing the gap with regard to transplantation, and with regard to home dialysis are the areas that we focus on there.
Thank you. I was curious. Thank you. And so, Jamie, thinking a little bit about working at these biotech pharma companies, for example, and with the clinical trials, one of the biggest challenge is not just only recruiting folks, but retaining them. And you started talking about financial burden is one component to it. Obviously, when people are working, do they get the time off, for example, to be able to participate? Is your insurance company paying for clinical trials? The list goes on and on. I'd love to hear from your perspective, working for these big organizations that's highly focused in this area, how are you all able to retain folks in the space?
Yeah, and I think it was brought up earlier, retention on clinical trials is very important to be able to do a well-conducted trial and generate high-quality data. And I've fortunate to have the experience of having worked with companies that really invested a lot. Particularly, it started with the pandemic to make sure clinical trials provided more access to underserved, underrepresented patients. Probably the best example of that was at a company, Genentech Roche, when I was leading medical affairs for the U.S. During the pandemic. We had a drug we were repurposing for COVID-19 pneumonia called Actemra, tocilizumab, and we knew from real-world evidence that patients that were impacted by COVID were the Black Hispanic patient populations that were primarily in community-based hospitals. And so we focused entirely on community-based hospitals to be able to get access to those patients. And so it turned out that it was a randomized placebo-controlled pivotal trial for Actemra for COVID-19 pneumonia. It turned out to be the fastest running phase 3 trial in the history of Genentech Roche by going to community-based hospitals. Obviously, the bar is a lot lower because the patients are actually sitting at the hospital, so they're easy to identify and recruit, and then be able to keep on the clinical trial. At the end of the trial, there were 400 patients enrolled, and 85% of them were considered minorities, so 55% Hispanic, about 15% Black, and 12% surprisingly Native Americans, which are very difficult to enroll in any clinical trials. The trial ended up being positive at the end and led ultimately to an approval for COVID-19 pneumonia, which had a big commercial impact, but also it allowed us to educate and promote in underserved communities, which has no experience with that product. And that was the benefit of getting the approval. It was being used off-label, but to be able to educate and promote compliantly requires a drug approval. And so since then, we at that former company started doing other clinical trials for outpatient-based diseases like multiple sclerosis, diabetic macular edema, that enriched entirely in Black and Hispanic patient populations that were not part of the pivotal trials that led to those approvals. And so it is possible to do these trials in underrepresented patients, to do them in a way that allows retention on the clinical trials. A big part of it is making sure, for example, something as simple as informed consents are done in multiple languages so that patients can participate in the clinical trials. To build trust, you have study coordinators that we could actually supply as a sponsor compliantly, but they actually are the same demographic as the patients, and they can build trust to be able to recruit those patients onto clinical trials.
On the retention side, it's very interesting in the rare disease space, we are talking about N of 1 trials, 10 patients, 50 patients. So every patient is so important. They need and deserve white glove treatment for them to enroll and stay and complete the trial. And already they have a burden that they are carrying with the disease, and the clinical trial should not become an extra burden, but fit into their lifestyle. And so that's so critical. And and it begins at the first contact with the patient, right? Or maybe even before. In the well-informed patients are likely to complete the study, right? And so retention begins with informing, educating in languages, in multimedia content that they are easy to consume, not give them 50-page informed consent to read and understand in languages that even PhDs can't understand. And it's true. I tried finding a clinical trial for my family member for a dry AMD disease, and I shortlisted to 13 trials, but beyond that, I needed an ophthalmologist to help identify which trial they could even potentially be a fit for. So it's not meant for layperson, right? And so that's one aspect. Then the digital aspect of engaging them by text messaging, email, telephones, and in communication channels that mean to them and that's comfortable to them. I think those are some.
Yeah. I would ask the audience a question. How many people here have ever been faced with a really serious condition where you quickly needed to learn about that condition? And I would say around the room, there's better than average health knowledge. How many people have difficulty trying to understand that material and getting through it? Okay. Lots of hands, and I've raised my own hand as well. Add to that the emotions that you're dealing with in that situation. We've got to learn to talk to people differently. You're a patient and you want to find out whether it's the care that you need, whether you're considering being in a clinical trial. You've got to get through that information and understand whether this is the best thing for you. We've got to learn. You don't need to know every single detail about the trial. I know there are requirements about, really making sure that you're transparent and all of that. But you can do that and still provide information in not just in terms of, we talk about the fact that many of our patients, and we do reach out particularly at the American Kidney Fund to low-income patients, and so many of our patients may also be educationally challenged. But for any of us, this is a difficult, it's very difficult to navigate this whole thing. And we've got to learn to talk to people in terms that they can understand and give them the information that they need, honest, transparent information that will help them make decisions.
I'm going to come back to the consent issue because very early in the days of the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition, we actually did a lot of phone calls with patients. And the question we asked, why didn't you participate? It's easy to find out why people did. Interestingly enough, informed consent was one of the things. I'm not actually that surprised. Originally, informed consent was designed to protect patients from participating in research that they didn't understand or didn't know what they were getting into. Noble goal. But as you can imagine, when you turn over the creation of a document to a hospital's legal team, academicians who tend to overthink everything, as well as regulators, that you're not exactly going to get a simple to read document. Even for something as simple as I'd like to have my blood donated for, a particular study, can be a 15 to 20 page document. So that's no longer about informed consent. That's more of an exculpatory document for the people running the study, or just a well-intentioned but over-the-top effort to do that. I think one of the biggest things we can work on is actually making informed consent more informed so that it's easy to understand. It's something a patient can actually look at and use. And there are ways to do these things. You don't have to put every last word in the document. You can link out to things. There's lots of ways to do this. Harsha's done a good job with doing some digital methods for doing informed consent, and there's a lot of efforts that way. But it's one of those things we need to pull back and actually restore to its original purpose.
Thank you, everybody. What a great conversation. Before we wrap up this part, because I'm going to do a Q&A from the audience, I'm curious to you all to maybe a couple of wise words, because we are hyper-focused on ensuring that we have all people included in these research and clinical trials. We recognize there are so many challenges in life that prohibits you perhaps from either being recruited or staying within the trials. And so if you had some wisdom to share upon our audience here, we'd love to hear it. And anyone can go first.
Why don't we start?
I'll start. Okay. I think the other thing that we should give some thought to, and many of these things have already been mentioned, but the one that has not been mentioned is the relationship between particularly primary care physicians or the provider where patients most likely get care. Many patients get their care in emergency rooms. Many patients get their care, their only care, even when they have serious conditions, from primary care physicians, or they get referred to specialists much later on. I think we have to also figure out ways of how to inform those providers at those levels about, what's going on and how to talk with patients about clinical trials. They will not necessarily know the particular clinical trial because they're dealing with too broad an array of issues, but just talking with patients about the fact that these are, and being able to point them to a website, to a phone number where they can get more information. I think we also, in terms of the conversations that go on between providers and patients, have to educate the health physicians and the providers on the fact that all patients should have the opportunity to consider whether or not they should be in a clinical trial. The healthcare provider should not exclude people by not telling them about it. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done at that level, because the patients that we want to get to often don't see the specialists who may be better informed until much later on.
All right, words of wisdom. That's an assumption that I have. So here's what I would say. I did a little digging over the last 10 years, and I looked at trials that succeeded and I looked at trials that failed. And we went through the clinicaltrials.gov where they all end up listed. Like I said again, 75% of orphan rare disease trials fail. The economic loss on that is over $18 billion. Those are trials and treatments and potential things that could help patients that are lost. And the thing to remember is most of them are not lost because the science wasn't good. Most of them were lost because either the trial design was wrong or the patients just could not participate in this trial. So, if you really want to change behaviors and get people doing things, financial incentive is not a bad way, and not losing those billions and billions of dollars. But more importantly, not having those patients have an opportunity to have a potential new treatment or a potential new community, that's a powerful incentive. And I think one of the things we have to make sure people do is when you're designing that trial, really think it through. Think about, how am I going to access all of the patients? Because they are each precious. Each one of those is precious, and you have to think through what is in their best interest, what is the way that they can participate that makes this doable, and work with them on that. Because otherwise, if you try to use the same old clinical trial design that we'll use, like I said, for one of these 100,000, million patient diseases, you're probably not going to succeed.
I don't know how wise this is, but it's somewhat intuitive probably, is that, well, trust is obviously a key component, but it doesn't start and stop with the clinical trial. It's after the clinical trial as well that is really imperative, I think, to be able to engage the communities effectively for future clinical trials. Patients don't want to feel like they're being experimented on and not know what the outcome of the trials are. So at the end of the clinical trial, it's critical to re-engage with the community and explain what the results of the trial, whether they're positive or negative, and how the patients actually invested their time to help contribute to research. And that could be provided in the form of lay summaries. I've done that in companies before and provided that through the investigators to re-engage the community. You can't just walk away after you're done with the clinical trial. Otherwise, you'll lose the trust that you've built during the course of the clinical trial to be able to do future clinical trials. And it's going to be a long-term investment to build that relationship between the sponsors that do the trials and the communities that participate in the trials.
Yeah, from my perspective, not necessarily wisdom, but opinion, it's a collaboration, right? In the rare disease space, we have both the patients driving innovation and demanding speed and of treatment because patients are dying. And on the other hand, it's the sponsors that really have the need to bring their therapy to market faster. And so it's a bottoms up and tops down meeting somewhere in the middle. And so that collaboration between patient advocacy groups and sponsors, along with sites, investigators, at the very beginning, before the protocol is written, and throughout the journey in a clinical trial. I think that's my takeaway, is having that collaboration frequently and in real time.
This is not wisdom, this is observation. There is no better field to work in. If I went back to 1985 and I had to decide what I'm going to do with my career all over again, hands down, it's working in rare disease and with patients with genetic conditions. Never will you meet braver, more driven, more dedicated people, whether it's the patient, the family. It's what makes you get up every morning and want to do it. So for those of you who are not part of a rare disease family or community and are thinking about it, hands down, best field of medicine, best field to be in, and one of the most inspiring you can be in.
One more round of applause for the panelists. Thank you.